At 6:12 a.m. local time in the southern Caribbean Sea, the sun had only just climbed above the horizon when the U.S. aircraft carrier moved through calm, mirror-like water, its massive hull carving a long white trail behind it. On deck, everything followed the usual rhythm. Flight crews worked with calm precision. Radar operators studied their screens in silence. Nothing in the scene suggested immediate tension. This was a routine passage through international waters far beyond any country's territorial boundary, carried out under established maritime law. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the mood was steady and disciplined. Dozens of softly glowing displays tracked air, surface, and subsurface contacts across hundreds of nautical miles. The carrier was not sailing alone. Destroyers and cruisers formed a layered protective screen around it, all connected through a shared tactical picture. To an untrained observer, it looked like just another quiet morning at sea. To the Navy, it was vigilance in its purest form. Then, at 6:17, a surface contact appeared. At first, it seemed ordinary, a single radar return, moving slowly, well beyond visual range. Traffic in the Caribbean was nothing unusual. Merchant ships, fishing boats, patrol craft. The watch officer marked it and continued, but less than a minute later, a second contact appeared. Then a third, then two more. 5 surface contacts, same sector, same general course. That was when the room grew noticeably quieter. The radar operator leaned in and adjusted the filters. These contacts were not spaced like civilian traffic. They were moving with purpose, holding relative positions while gradually increasing speed. Their transponders were silent. No AIS, no identifying broadcast, just 5 steel hulls moving through open water. Track group established, the operator reported evenly. The tactical action officer stepped closer to the main display. The distance was closing, not aggressively, not yet, but steadily. The formation looked loose at first glance, almost casual. But to trained eyes, it was anything but random. 2 contacts slightly ahead, 1 centered, 2 trailing wider behind. This was not coincidence, it was geometry. Identification came quickly. Venezuelan Navy vessels, surface combatants, and patrol ships, armed, rough-edged, and unmistakable. Their presence in international waters was not unlawful by itself. Warships are allowed to operate there, but formations tell their own story, and this one was clearly deliberate. On the bridge, the carrier's captain received the update without changing posture. No raised voice, no dramatic orders, just acknowledgement. Foreign warships had approached U.S. carriers before, and they would do so again. The real question was not who they were, it was what they planned to do next. At 6:22, the Venezuelan ships adjusted course. The change was subtle, only a few degrees, but the effect was immediate. Their projected closest point of approach began to shrink. They were no longer running parallel, they were converging. Standard bridge-to-bridge radio calls were prepared in English and Spanish. Clear, professional, routine. No response. The calls were repeated. Still no response. Even then, there was no panic. Inside CIC, every movement was logged. Bearings, speed, timestamps. The carrier's escorts tightened their positions almost invisibly, refining the screen without drawing attention to it. Sensors shifted from passive watchfulness to a higher state of awareness. Not hostile, not yet, but fully attentive. At this stage, no weapon systems were activated, no missiles readied, no gun mounts turned. In moments like this, U.S. Navy doctrine is straightforward. Record everything, stay steady, and do not escalate unless forced to. But 5 warships do not move like this by accident. By 6:26, the Venezuelan formation had closed enough for its intent to become impossible to dismiss. 2 ships pushed forward on the carrier's port side vector. 2 more drifted wider, angling to shape the surrounding space. The 5th stayed astern, holding distance and watching. It was not an outright strike pattern. It was something more measured, pressure. And as the range continued to narrow, one reality became impossible to ignore inside the Combat Information Center of the U.S. aircraft carrier. This was no longer routine. Whatever followed would be recorded, studied, and remembered long after the ships eventually turned away. At 6:31 a.m., the geometry on the radar screen no longer allowed for polite interpretations. What had started as 5 distant contacts had now become a coordinated maneuver, and everyone inside CIC understood it at the same time. This was not simple shadowing. This was shaping the battle space. The Venezuelan warships increased speed almost together. Not a dramatic burst, just enough to keep tightening the gap. Their formation became more compact, their spacing more disciplined, the kind of movement that suggested rehearsal. 2 ships edged toward the carrier's projected track. The wider pair kept drifting outward, stretching the envelope the trailing ship remained back, clearly positioned to observe, record, and react. On the main display, the closest point of approach kept dropping, 5 nautical miles, then 4. CPA decreasing, the surface warfare coordinator reported calmly. No one raised their voice, no one had to. Every sailor in that room understood what those numbers meant. At sea, margins disappear quickly, steel moves fast. Water offers very little forgiveness. The carrier did not alter course. It sounded simple, but the decision carried real weight. A turnaway could be interpreted as yielding, holding steady projected confidence, discipline, and control. The captain's message was unmistakable. The United States would not change course because of pressure alone. International waters were not open to negotiation. Aboard the escorting destroyers, posture shifted quietly. Helm adjustments came in fractions of a degree. Spacing narrowed just enough to preserve overlapping sensor coverage and maneuver freedom. From the outside, the strike group still appeared unchanged. Inside the network, every unit was fully alert. At 6:35, radio calls went out again. Venezuelan naval vessels operating in the vicinity. This is a United States Navy aircraft carrier conducting lawful transit in international waters. State your intentions. The message was repeated in Spanish, silence. And that silence said plenty. Electronic support measures began detecting low-power radar emissions from the approaching ships. Not targeting radar, not yet. Search sweeps, navigation scans, careful probing to judge distance and movement. Every emission was logged, time-stamped, and cataloged. The carrier was not merely being watched, it was being studied. Above, on the flight deck, the morning routine continued, but now with sharper edges. Aircraft were secured with extra care. Deck crews moved faster and with greater focus. Below, air wing officers tracked events closely. No one needed to explain what the next phase might look like. At 6:38, the Venezuelan ships closed to less than 3 nautical miles. That mattered. Inside CIC, the tactical watch supervisor marked the moment as an escalation threshold. Under the rules of engagement, this range demanded heightened documentation and readiness. Not confrontation, not open conflict, but readiness. A Seahawk helicopter was placed on alert status. It remained on deck, rotors still. No dramatic launch, no theater, just preparedness. Its sensors alone, high-resolution optics, infrared systems, laser range capabilities, were enough to shift the dynamic if needed. Presence without provocation. The Venezuelan formation continued to compress. The 2 lead ships now sat slightly ahead of the carrier's bow line, angled inward. The wider ships held their arcs, limiting room laterally. The trailing vessels stayed behind, steady and patient. It was a box, not perfect, not sealed, but unmistakable in purpose. Still, the carrier held course. Inside CIC, time seemed to stretch. Seconds were counted, bearings updated, every movement recorded. No one wasted time on speculation. Speculation had no value here. Facts did. Then at 6:41, one Venezuelan ship made a sharper turn, small but significant. The CPA fell again. 2 nautical miles. For the first time that morning, the room felt the shift. Not fear, focus. This was no longer the kind of encounter that drifted apart on its own. It had become a test of discipline, nerve, and doctrine. And as 5 warships continued closing around a single U.S. aircraft carrier, one truth settled over the Combat Information Center like extra weight. Whatever happened next would not be decided by who carried the larger arsenal, but by who made the first mistake. At 6:44 a.m., anyone standing on the decks of the Venezuelan ships might have believed the picture was simple. 5 vessels had compressed the space around one aircraft carrier. The distance had closed. The carrier had not changed heading. No jets had launched. No visible weapon systems had shifted. From the outside, that could easily be mistaken for hesitation. Inside the U.S. carrier's Combat Information Center, the reality was entirely different. The moment the Venezuelan formation stabilized, the strike group's advantage became both invisible and overwhelming. Every radar sweep, every throttle change, every correction in heading from the approaching ships was being absorbed into a single, unified tactical picture. The carrier was not reacting because it did not need to. It was listening. And in modern naval operations, listening can matter more than making noise. An E-2D Hawkeye, already airborne far beyond visual range, tightened its orbit at altitude. From there, the entire surface picture sharpened instantly. What looked like simple blips from a distance became streams of usable detail. Speed shifts, formation discipline, maneuver timing. The aircraft fed all of it directly into the strike group's network in real time. What the Venezuelan commanders could not see was how clearly they were being read. Their formation revealed training standards. Their spacing exposed command discipline. Tiny inconsistencies between ships hinted at which vessel was truly leading and which were following. Even the delay between one maneuver and the next painted a picture of experience, communication flow, and reaction time. Below decks, the carrier's linked systems quietly cataloged every electromagnetic clue: navigation radar pulses, search sweeps, fire control adjacent signatures, short communication bursts between ships. None of it crossed into open hostility, but all of it added depth to an intelligence profile that would remain valuable long after the encounter ended. At 6:47, the Venezuelan ships made another coordinated move. Two slowed slightly. The wider pair tightened inward. The trailing vessel edged closer, reducing its offset. To the Venezuelan crews, it may have felt like they were tightening control. To the U.S. Navy, it looked like pressure beginning to show. Formations under strain rarely stay perfect. Small corrections build up. Human judgment enters the picture. And that is where the advantage starts to shift. The carrier stayed on course, speed unchanged. That decision forced the Venezuelan ships to keep making choices, keep adjusting, keep exposing more of their intent. The longer the carrier refused to respond visibly, the more information it collected. At 6:49, the first hint of hesitation appeared. One Venezuelan vessel lagged just a fraction of a second behind the others during a turn, barely visible to the eye. Inside CIC, it stood out immediately. That tiny delay suggested decentralized execution. Orders passed along rather than anticipated. A subtle difference, but a very important one. The strike group's escorts shifted again, quietly refining their positions, not to threaten, but to preserve sensor coverage and keep freedom of movement intact. From the outside, it still looked like almost nothing had changed. Inside the network, the situation was crystal clear. The encounter had reached a strange balance. No rounds fired, no warnings shouted, just 5 ships applying pressure and one carrier refusing to blink. Then the equation changed. At 6:51, the carrier's air operations officer made a single recommendation. Not a command, not an escalation. A tool. Launch the Seahawk. Not to challenge, not to intimidate, to observe and to make it clear that observation was now happening in plain sight. The helicopter was brought fully to readiness. Crew strapped in, systems powered, sensors aligned. For the moment, it remained on deck, rotors locked. That was the pivot point. Because while the Venezuelan commanders focused on the carrier's size, its silence, and its refusal to move, they were missing the most important fact of the morning. The longer this continued, the more uneven the situation became. The U.S. Navy was not the side being boxed in. It was the side in control. And as the Venezuelan ships held position, unaware of how thoroughly they had already been mapped, measured, and understood, the next move, when it came, would not be loud. It would be precise. At 6:53 a.m., the Seahawk lifted off the deck without ceremony. There was no dramatic scramble, no burst of noise meant to send a message. The helicopter rose smoothly into the morning air, banking low and steady, its rotors beating a controlled rhythm over the sea. To those aboard the Venezuelan ships, it was the first visible change since the encounter began, and that alone made it impossible to ignore. The aircraft held at low altitude, only a few hundred feet above the water, staying well within non-provocative flight parameters. It didn't rush straight at the formation. Instead, it moved with intention, positioned so every bridge in the area could see it clearly. Inside the Seahawk, there was almost no conversation. There didn't need to be. The systems were already working. High-resolution cameras focused on hull numbers, deck movement, and bridge activity. Infrared sensors tracked engine heat and subtle changes in speed. Every frame was time-stamped, geotagged, and streamed directly back to the carrier's Combat Information Center. This wasn't about intimidation. It was about making one thing clear. Everything was being seen. As the helicopter closed in, the Venezuelan formation reacted almost immediately. One vessel shifted its heading slightly, another eased back on speed. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The presence of an airborne sensor platform changed the entire dynamic. From this moment on, every move would be recorded, undeniable, and reviewable far beyond the Caribbean. At 6:56, the Seahawk settled into position near the forward quarter of the lead Venezuelan ship. It didn't fly overhead. It didn't make aggressive passes. It simply matched speed and held a safe, controlled distance. Then came a brief signal. A low-power laser designation flickered on for just a moment, touching the bridge of the nearest ship. Not a weapon, not a threat, just a message that didn't need translation. We see you. Moments later, a calm radio call followed. Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy aircraft operating in international waters. Your movements are being recorded. Maintain safe distance and alter course to avoid escalation. The message was repeated in Spanish. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the formation began to loosen. The ships that had been spread wide increased their separation. One of the forward vessels reduced speed slightly. Wake patterns shifted. The tight geometry that had defined the situation for nearly half an hour started to break apart. Inside the Combat Information Center, there was no reaction beyond observation. The data confirmed what the sensors showed. Closest point of approach stabilized, then slowly began to increase. The pressure was fading. Around 7 o'clock, one Venezuelan ship made a clear turn away from the carrier's path. Not rushed, not chaotic, controlled and deliberate. The others followed one after another. No alarms, no sudden movements, no activation of weapon systems. The carrier stayed exactly as it had been, same speed, same course. It didn't need to do anything else. The situation was resolving on its own. The Seahawk remained on station just long enough to confirm the change. Its sensors captured every angle of the disengagement. Crew members on the Venezuelan ship stepped away from rails and equipment. Brief bursts of internal radio chatter followed. No threatening signals appeared on the spectrum. Then, just as quietly as it arrived, the helicopter turned away. It climbed, banked smoothly, and returned to the carrier. Mission complete. By 7:04, the 5 Venezuelan ships were no longer closing in. The distance between them and the carrier increased minute by minute. What had started as a coordinated approach ended as a controlled withdrawal. To an outside observer, it might have looked uneventful. No dramatic visuals, no high-speed aircraft overhead, no tense standoff frozen into headlines. But to those who understand naval operations, the message was clear. 5 warships moved in quickly on a U.S. aircraft carrier. The carrier never reacted visibly, and in the end, it was discipline, not noise, that shaped the outcome. Because in modern maritime encounters, the side that remains composed doesn't just avoid escalation, it defines the entire situation. By 7:10 a.m., the Caribbean Sea looked calm again. The Venezuelan ships were still visible on radar, but no longer influencing the environment. Their courses separated, their speeds returned to normal. What had been a coordinated maneuver less than an hour earlier now appeared as routine traffic moving away from a carrier strike group that had never altered its path. On the surface, nothing remarkable had happened. That was exactly the point. Inside the Combat Information Center, the entire encounter was already being archived. Every radar sweep, every course correction, every signal and maneuver had been recorded and synchronized. The Seahawk's video feed was stored frame by frame, timestamps, bearing lines, infrared overlays, everything preserved. This wasn't just documentation, it was leverage. From a strategic perspective, the result was decisive without being loud. No shots fired, no ultimatums, no deviation from standard procedures. Yet the outcome was unmistakable. 5 warships applied pressure, and that pressure collapsed. The reason is simple. Modern naval power isn't just about weapons, it's about control, of information, of timing, and of decision-making space. Throughout the entire encounter, the carrier strike group controlled all 3. By maintaining course, the carrier denied any symbolic advantage. By staying disciplined and measured, it forced the opposing ships to keep reacting, adjusting, and revealing their intent. Every move they made reduced their own flexibility while increasing the clarity of the situation. The Seahawks' arrival wasn't escalation. It was a calculated step, fully within procedure, that shifted the encounter from uncertainty to accountability. Once everything was clearly observed and recorded, the opposing commanders faced a choice: continue pressing and risk consequences that would be permanently documented, or step away. They chose to step away, and that decision matters far beyond a single morning at sea. Encounters like this don't exist in isolation. They build patterns. They shape expectations. They influence future behavior. What was shown that day was a willingness to test limits. What was demonstrated in response was something more significant: the ability to absorb pressure without losing control. That is the essence of gray zone conflict. No open confrontation, no declarations, just calculated actions designed to test resolve and gain advantage. In that environment, restraint isn't weakness, it's a tool. But it only works when it's backed by capability and confidence. For the sailors on board, the day continued as usual. Shifts changed, aircraft operations resumed, meals were served, the event became another entry in the log. But at higher levels, among planners, analysts, and commanders, the implications were already being studied. The Caribbean, like many regions today, remains a space shaped not by open conflict, but by proximity and perception. Every close approach carries weight. Every maneuver sends a message. And the message that morning was simple. If you move in to apply pressure, you have to be ready for what that pressure reveals. Because when one side stays calm, stays within the rules, and records everything, escalation stops being an advantage and starts becoming a risk. And that's the final twist. 5 Venezuelan warships moved in expecting to shape the situation. Instead, the situation shaped them. So here's the question. Should the United States respond more forcefully in moments like this? Or is disciplined restraint actually the stronger move? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-world naval encounters explained clearly and in detail, make sure you're subscribed. Because out in international waters, the most important moments are often the quiet ones.